recently, our government had in the recent years been very focused on persuading Singaporeans to accept measures which could be generally be viewed as counterintuitive by any layman. Counterintuitive means logic tells you one thing, but what they suggest tells you something completely different. The recent years meaning largely over the last decade. Let us look at some of these measures and also how does the latest water tax align with them. You decide for yourself. Land, water and air are resources which are endowed upon all human beings by nature. As such, resources within or duly acquired by the state are for the fair usage of all citizens for their livelihoods. Despite the obvious and intuitive starting point from here, we had at many times been presented before us variations which seems to run counter to that logic. Let us look at some of those counterintuitive notions which had been thrust before us. The ruling party in its earlier formative years, let's give it to them, had some capable leaders who had formulated policies for the country and had been generally successful. But as to whether all those leaders were of the same mold or whether the present leaders are of the same characteristic, that we shall leave it to a separate question entirely for another day. But the fact remains, success there was. Leaders of those days had mostly taken pains to be circumspect of the people's fair interests and shaped their policies accordingly. Okay, they had done their part. Taxation policies in particular. Okay, people were not unduly overburdened. There was some sense of balance. And as such, those leaders of the past era had rightfully earned their accolades. Okay, what are the present day issues? Land is very clearly a limited resource for Singapore. No one will deny that, which must have been clearly aware to our present leadership. But that did not prevent them from the population expansion plans to 6.9 million. Despite all the objections put up by the people, their seemingly superior logic of that expansion plan is still elusive to many. How many of you know why? Any rational explanation for that? No one knows. The effects had been taken upon us, and along with that came a counterintuitive statement. You know all from who? Foreigners create good jobs for locals. We have yet to see that being realized in any meaningful way, despite a voracious foreigner intake. As a consequence, at least one local had been tremendously moved to express his sorrows by shedding tears in matters regarding that expansion plan. I'm not talking about my friend here. We all know who. And further, also as a consequence of that population increase, housing prices shot up. Land again the cause of another counterintuitive statement. It is affordable. We heard, and not once, I believe repeatedly. How in the world would that have been possible? We had asked ourselves many times. However, we had since stopped rationalizing and stopped asking. I could go on with more and more of their statements, which just refuse to add up and make sense. But that's not my objective here today. I could go on and give you more of such statements, okay, which will go against the logical norms. But we have to go on and discuss. Now, the recent water price and tax hike, whichever way you look at it, looms large in front of us, which bears an uncanny resemblance to the earlier mentioned policies. Okay, is there a common thread through all these policies? It is very clearly the total, it is a demonstration for the total disregard for what the people's concerns are, and when certain government decisions are taken, and a refusal to view the issues from the people's perspective. This, okay, thank you. This must change. You cannot simply shut yourself away from what the people's concerns are and keep insisting that what you are formulating for the people is always right beyond reproach. It cannot go on working that way. Regarding the water tax, much has already been discussed since its announcement on the 20th of Feb with regard to its impact. Were the consequences thought through thoroughly, sufficiently? I have my reservations. The inflationary pressures it would have on the general economy are all too obvious and cannot be overemphasized. One analysis which had been offered and which I would consider inflationary consequences would be muted and negligible. To assume that they would simply pass with the situation returning to normal in due course would be horrendously ignoring the stark realities of such a measure. It cites an example calculation whereby there would only be a minuscule increase in the price of a cup of coffee as a consequence. Really? Check again. And with coffee prices only, also please check again. It would be very likely such that when one wants to face up to all the difficulties caused by the water price increase, you might want to go to the coffee shop and drown your sorrows. That too will be pricier. Okay, and what about other related social and health issues too, mind you? For one, there would be a drastic compromise in overall hygiene. Wouldn't that be? Personal hygiene in particular, and followed closely by food handling hygiene. I do not want to go into details and risk being called an alarmist. Go think for yourself. Perhaps consider an extreme scenario to ponder over. If there were to be another epidemic, heaven forbids, and we have to risk, and by the way, we have a higher risk of that present day than before, with a higher population density. With the increased population density, we definitely have a higher risk in that regard. Not only coffee shops, clinics and medical establishments would have to use more water and higher priced water. If the drastic policy is going to be imposed on the people, the minimum the people should expect is a clear logic being put forward as to how the decision was arrived at. Rocket science it may be. In other words, please have sufficient transparency, not the usual we know everything and you know nothing stance of haughtiness often adopted. To refuse transparency would simply be riding on the accolades earned from the successes achieved by the policymakers of the previous era. It would be evident that those are the past goodwills accorded by the people upon those who had rightfully earned them. In a policy formulation of the present day, the goodwill seemed to have been relied upon by default too often, as a consequence of which it had already worn thin over the years due to overuse. To underscore the situation of thinning out of that goodwill was the request from Singaporeans for the efficiency of a government to be trusted by the people. To be sure, they are not an entirely new government. They had won 70% less than 2 years ago, and with that seemingly high level of trust from the populace, to make such a request is also counterintuitive. Now, with regard to all this, let's have a clear explanation as to why this policy has to be pushed down to the people against all objection. Why the 30% increase? Okay, thank you.